Kia ora, ko Matthew Hobbs toku ingoa, ko the Peak District Tamanga, ko the Riverland Te Awa, no Sheffield aho. I'm a senior lecturer here at the University of Canterbury and a co-director of the GeoHealth Lab, and today I'm going to share with you some of the findings we've been looking at using the same study that Phoebe has very kindly introduced, the Christchurch Health and Development Study, so that's saved me a bit of time there. But we're really interested in a potential association between exposure to air pollution in childhood and adolescent and child development and mental health outcomes in the Christchurch Health and Development Study. So this comes from a wider program of research that I'm leading, looking at improving the quality of geospatial data in New Zealand, but also looking at improving the quality of study designs to focus on a more robust kind of spatial life course epidemiology approach. It includes a lot of people. A lot of people have contributed to this, and I'm presenting on behalf of that team today. And a lot of partners have contributed to this as well. So just acknowledging those funders. But this project today looks at the link between air pollution in childhood and mental health and well-being in adolescence and late childhood. So Christchurch is a really good place, unfortunately, to do this research because it's historically had quite a significant air pollution problem ranging back to the 70s and 1980s. From a child development perspective, we also know that the prenatal period and childhood period is a really important period of development for the brain, but also the child. And air pollution exposure during that period might be associated with a potentially harmful impact on their well-being, but also their development and mental health. While we often have really good measures of our outcomes, so mental health, child development, we often have quite poor measures of exposure. So we might have one address at one time point, and that's what we base all of our measures on of air pollution. So we wanted to try and improve that within this study to look at a life course approach to capturing longer term exposure to air pollution. And just in case you're wondering, there has been quite a lot of research that's linked air pollution to mental health in adulthood, particularly depression and suicidal ideation, but the associations in childhood are much more inconsistent. So what we did is we took the first 16 years of life in the Christchurch Health and Development Study that Phoebe's very kindly already introduced, and we looked at air pollution for the first 10 years of life, but also including the prenatal period in 1976 in these children in Christchurch. And we then looked at their adolescent development and mental health outcomes from age 10 to 16. So we had 5 mental health outcome measures: depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, alcohol abuse and substance abuse in the age 14 to 16 interviews. We had 11 developmental outcomes. I'm only going to share 3 today because in the interest of time it would take me too long to go through all of them. But the ones I'm going to share today are attentional problems, conduct problems and oppositional defiance disorder. And just to kind of show you what we had to go through, we actually started this kind of GIS arm of the Christchurch Health and Development Study about 5 years ago now with Phoebe and Susie. And when we went into there, they actually had all of the data in filing cabinets. So we had to go through all of these filing cabinets one by one, digitize all the addresses, manually try and find the addresses and then convert them to a geographic coordinate. And that process took about 2 years in terms of a process. The air pollution data from the 70s and 80s was on a punch card. So for anyone that remembers that, I've never heard of this before. But I rang the IT department and I said, hey, I need a bit of help with some data. And they were like, yeah, no worries, we can help you. And so I've got some punch card data that I need to convert into digital format, and it suddenly went quiet and I never got a call back. And then the other problem we had was that the maps from the 70s were hand-drawn air pollution maps. So again, we had to do a bit of work to digitize those. So what did we do? We had 69 monitoring sites across Christchurch, and we had to impute some of the data from 1973 to 1988. So basically what we got here, as you can see, Dr. Lucas Marek did a lot of this work, but we essentially had around 18 monitoring sites where we had data from 73 through to 88 for the Christchurch city, and that's where a lot of the children were born at the time. So here you've got the monthly average concentration. You can see the peaks in dark purple in the middle of winter. So we have high winter peaks during the 70s and 80s that kind of gradually gets better over time. And then we did some kind of spatial interpolation to convert that to a geospatial air pollution measure to look at it over time as well, from kind of prenatal through to 10 years of age, using a range of different variables. And you can see the high yellow areas are kind of the levels of air pollution that would be extremely high, through to the more rural areas, which would be lower. Susie Deng then worked as a research assistant on this project and did some latent class growth mixture models, which basically, in a nutshell, gives us a trajectory of these childhood air pollution over time. So from age kind of prenatal through to age 10, we have their exposure at every year, and we can see if it's going up or down, basically. So we came up with 4 classifications, and this is quite important. So the biggest kind of class was those who were consistently exposed to low levels of air pollution throughout all of childhood. It declined over time. This black bar here, this is levels of black smoke up the side, age along the bottom, and this black line here is kind of low levels of air pollution, which is declining over time. Class 2 was the red class, so they're kind of children who were exposed to high levels during mid-childhood. The green bar, which is higher kind of persistent levels over childhood, and then an interesting one, which is the blue one, which is class 4, elevated prenatal, which we know is an important period of child development and potentially an important period of exposure. So what we've got here is basically a trajectory of exposure to air pollution for the first 10 years of life, including the prenatal period. And what we then did is said, well, how are these trajectories of air pollution related to mental health outcomes and development? What's really important about the Christchurch Health and Development Study is we can adjust for parental mental health, child characteristics, family background characteristics, socioeconomic status. So a lot of the confounders that are missing from existing literature are included here. When we looked at the unadjusted relationships, we've got depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, alcohol and substance abuse down the side. And our reference category that we're comparing it to is those who were lowest exposure. So basically across most of the associations that we saw in the unadjusted models, those from the persistently high exposure and sometimes in the elevated prenatal and sometimes in the peak mid-childhood were at a higher risk of most of these mental health outcomes. Once we adjusted for all of the different confounding factors, some of the associations remained for mental health, for substance abuse and suicidal ideation, and the anxiety one flipped in the opposite direction, which was interesting. So there are some associations here with mental health outcomes, but they're quite small in terms of their effect size. So here we can see there's a higher odds, for example, of substance abuse in class 2 and 3, which is peak mid-childhood and persistently high exposure, but really the confidence intervals are quite wide, so we're not too confident in the associations that we're seeing there. We then did the same thing for 11 developmental outcomes. I'm just going to show 3 of them here today. So attentional and conduct problems, as well as oppositional defiance disorder. Again, in the unadjusted models, we saw a higher odds of these outcomes occurring in those that were exposed to higher levels of air pollution in childhood. But once we adjusted for a range of family background, child background, and family functioning characteristics, these were largely attenuated. So the reason being, and I'll come on to that in a bit, is because the sample size was maybe a little bit small to detect some of these associations. But there are some signals, they're in the expected direction, and there are some signals that there may be a relationship between air pollution and mental health and development for our young people. So some of the limitations, there's some uncertainty in the exposure measures. So remember that data I showed you about how we constructed the air pollution? Well, actually, they're modelled estimates. We don't have the data for the 70s and 80s. We've had to go back in time to try and calculate some of those. We don't have particulate matter, which is the more contemporary measure of air pollution. We just have black smoke. So again, another limitation, but particulate matter didn't exist in the 70s and 80s. And then we also have some missing data where people moved away from Christchurch and they may have gone to Australia or China or the UK, and we don't have air pollution data for those. Some of the strengths are we do actually have exposure over time here. So we have every single address, including the prenatal period. We do account for the different trajectories that these children are exposed to in terms of the air pollution. And most importantly, I think we adjust for a lot of confounders in that child and family's history that other studies miss. So the next step really is to look at associations across the whole life course from prenatal to age 40 with some higher quality measures of air pollution to see if there's associations with adult mental health. And there's much more consistent associations between air pollution, especially PM2.5, and mental health outcomes in adulthood. So I suppose in conclusion, we did see some associations between air pollution exposure and some of the developmental and mental health outcomes in early adolescence. But really what was our limiting factor here was that our sample size probably wasn't quite big enough. So if you saw some of the effects, they were always tending in the right direction, but the confidence intervals pretty much always crossed 1. So we saw an effect, it was in the expected direction. If we had a larger sample size, it probably would have been statistically significant, but we haven't quite got the power in this particular study. But it does have a range of other strengths. The other thing as well is that the air pollution exposure of black smoke might not be quite sensitive enough to detect some of these associations that we're trying to do. But it makes a couple of steps in the right direction in terms of the kind of epidemiology and the way we're looking